I don't know what stories I told you last year, but I probably told you this one. But I'll tell it again right now while we're waiting. Of the my friend Cynthia Jewers, who is doing peace work in Africa, and she was visiting in Mali. She was talking with a Dogon elder, and she said, "Look what's happening. Your lands are being encroached on, palm oil plantations, climate change, all these terrible things are happening, and they're happening faster and faster. Don't you feel urgent to do something about it? Don't you feel the urgency that I feel?" And he said, "Urgency isn't something that we have around here. Well, is this just one more area where the white man coming from the developed country knows better than the Dogon how best to manage the world? Like we've done it with development, and imperialism, and Christianity, saying, we know better, here's how to do it. Here's what you do, you build factories, and you mechanize your farms, and you move to the cities, and you build highways and airports, and we know how you should do it. Here's how. And now it's kind of the same idea. We know better than you how to interface with reality. We know better than you. So that's something I've become a little bit wary of. So now that everybody's here, I'll begin welcome to the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And I am going to kind of continue a little bit from last year. Just how many people were here listening to me last year? Okay, good half maybe. Last year I really stepped my foot into it by bringing up two topics that are contentious in the community. One of them was the soundness of what we call science, both as an institution and as a method, a way of knowing. And I said some things about that were triggering to some people. The other thing I stepped my foot in was activism and the psychological motivations that sometimes are behind it. So I'm not going to do that this time, unless I already have.
Just find some new ones.
Maybe I'll find some new ones. Yeah. But this idea of we know better than you. Well, maybe I'll step my foot in just a tiny bit because it's going to be relevant to the theme of story, which comes up a lot. I mean, I noticed it coming up in the nonviolent communication workshop yesterday, and it's just kind of and in the work around judgment, self-judgment. I mean, these are all stories. So in the worldview that we have, we, meaning those of us in the dominant culture, which is everybody probably in this room to at least some extent. I mean, if you went to school, for example, now you may not be fully in the dominant culture for various reasons. You may have been marginalized in some way, and you might understand this marginalization in the end as some kind of gift that makes the flaws in the dominant worldview apparent. It's a kind of a painful gift to have, and a maybe alienating, a lonely gift to have, to be excluded from the story of normal. But in the end, it's also a gift, because guess what? Everybody is going to be ejected from the story of normal someday, unless you think that a finite planet can accommodate infinite growth. I mean, the world that we've constructed is unsustainable. It's falling apart, and the construct that we call normal and real isn't going to last forever. And so some of us have been kind of squeezed out early, perhaps having chosen this as a life path in order to be part of the welcoming committee when reality crumbles for everybody else. So thank you. Those of you who have walked this really lonely journey and have always sensed that there is some reason for this. You know, like that tiny spark, even in the darkest moment, like that tiny spark that's kept you alive. Yeah, I appreciate that. So, one of the underpinnings of reality as we've been taught it, that goes back hundreds of years, we the dominant, one of the aspects of it is that the world consists of facts. There's an objective reality outside of ourselves. Most cultures didn't really look at it that way. My friend Bayo Akomolafe, a Nigerian guy, PhD in psychology, professor at a university at the age of 30, brilliant guy. He became disenchanted with clinical psychology and went out to visit shamans in Nigeria. Say, what do you do about mental illness? And for one thing, they don't recognize mental illness as a category, even. Like, from the very beginning, they don't accept his premises. And then they thought it's really weird to have healing happening in a small room with two people. That's not the way we do it. And this one shaman said, and so Bayo was trying to get at the facts, you know, and he said, there are no facts, only stories. So I'm not actually saying there are no facts, only stories. Because if I say there are, I'm actually making a factual assertion. What I'm offering and what I'm going to offer today and what we're going to work with in various ways is the idea, is another map or another lens, the lens of story, that may be useful sometimes and may be not useful other times. As Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I'm not going to use evidence and logic to dismantle the house of evidence and logic. But we're going to inhabit another house for a while and see how we like it. So my name is Charles, and I like coming to this special place where at least one piece of the story of normal has been rejected. And I feel like when you reject one piece, eventually the whole fabric unravels. There's this process of kind of creeping radicalization. You know, at the beginning, so the story of normal, okay, yeah. I think we're going to be working with the transition between stories. I'm going to call it from the old story to the new story, with the recognition that the new story is actually much more ancient than the old story. But it's new for us. To the extent that we've been colonized, it's new for us. And its application to a mass society of billions of people, that's new too. So I'm going to call it the new story anyway, recognizing that the fixation on newness is part of the problem. Part of the old story, let's say. And I'm going to constantly resist the temptation to put things inside the category of the old story. For example, that separation is bad. So as I tell this story, keep that in mind. On some level, humanity decided to go on this journey of separation. In order to come back, eventually enriched by the journey. So there we were. You can imagine the oversoul of humanity having a meeting, a council, from this beautiful place. And we were like, yeah, we're going to venture into a place, into a world where of the worst imaginable horror, the places we're going to go, where people are ashamed of their bodies, where it's illegal to be naked, where every stream that you look at is probably poisonous to drink, where the desert spread almost everywhere, where people own each other, and that's okay, where every configuration of violence and abuse will happen. We're going to go to that place. Yeah. See, I really like not normal. You know? I just get so fed up with it, you know? Like, I get fed up with, like, you know, a bunch of people, like, not feeling, you know, or, like, and then a bunch of people not saying something, you know? I mean, like, who the hell are we anyway, you know? Like, let's be human, you know? Yeah, so thank you. Yeah.
I offer a possible other word rather than normal, since normal is really only the setting on the clothes dryer. How about conventional? Would that work?
Yeah. I like to use normal because it's such a trigger, you know?
Oh, all right.
It's a story, you know?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a story. Because that word is so freighted, you know? It's so loaded.
We're also out of it.
Yeah.
Away from it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Right, and it has like these value judgments around it, you know? Like, you know, you're just not normal.
As long
you know?
as we all know that.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So there we were, having this council, and realizing the places we were going to go. And knowing, why would we do that? You know? Why would we do that? The only way that it makes sense is that there is somewhere on the other side of that territory that we're reaching. That's what I call the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And once in a while, we're like, you know, walking through this territory, and we come up to a little hilltop, and we see it there. And we are like, yeah, I knew it all along. And I know that I'm about to go back down on this path into the swamp, into the forest, and I'm not going to see it anymore, and I'm going to doubt even this memory. but somehow it's going to live inside of me. But we were sitting in a council contemplating this journey, and some of us were concerned. And they said, what if we go to this place and never come back? What if we get lost in that territory? And that forgetting is so profound that we lose our way in the territory of separation. We forget that there's a destination and we never recover it, and we lose our humanity. We lose the skills, the senses that we need to even get that. We lose the knowledge. We lose the knowledge of how to be human. We lose the ability to ever look each other in the eye. We lose the alchemy of dreams, the alchemy of sex, the alchemy of plants. We lose these things that we need to know to get back. What happens then? So we came up with a plan, just in case. So some people, we kind of divided up into tasks, you know, and some people said, okay, we will not take this journey very far. We will hide in some remote place on the planet to preserve the knowledge of how to be human and how to return to this destination, which is also a return. We'll remember for you. And so groups of humanity went off into different places, and each one preserved some aspect of how to be human and some other way of knowing that would be necessary when we were in danger of getting lost in separation. That was one of the 3 seeds of reunion. The indigenous people who preserved something of the knowledge of how to be human and of the knowledge of reality, of truth. And that's why I think there's such an attraction to, and can I say it without quotes, indigenous wisdom? You know, amid all of the, you know, cultural appropriation, the commercialization, the continued robbery, you know, we've taken everything else from you. Now we're going to take your stories, your culture, and your symbols and turn them into artifacts and ways to construct an identity of, you know, a spiritual person or something like that, right? We're going to take that. But even, you know, there's all of that, yeah. But there's also a genuine need here and a recognition that the tools that we've developed are not enough to solve the crisis of civilization. And so this is part of the dynamics of transition that I'd like to work with you today about. So we live in a story I'm going to say a reality that's built on that story. And it works for a while. It's like a cocoon that we grow in. But then at some point, it stops working. It begins to fall apart. One crisis after another punctures it. And we try to repair it, and we try to hold on even tighter to that story. But eventually it falls apart, and we enter a space between stories where everything that I thought was normal I realized was just a fantasy. Everything I thought was real, I begin to question. Even who I am. Who am I? The story that I told, who am I, doesn't make sense either. I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know how to change the world, how to be effective as a human being anymore. And that is on a collective level where our civilization is heading right now. Not quite there yet. Not quite at that point of surrender, but bits and pieces of us are reaching that point. Many of us as individuals are kind of reaching it first. and bringing on the field for everybody else. And that's why that kind of surrender and the unknowing and the darkness, which is something we need, I think, to embrace and not vilify and equate with evil. The darkness is when you can't see, or perhaps when your ways of seeing stop working. And it's an empty space that brings in something new. So later on, I would like to talk about the idea of disrupting the story, as on like a lot of the things that people are doing to bring down the system are actually strengthening the system because they feed into some of its fundamental assumptions. For example, that the way to create change in the world is by exerting a force. The idea of conquering the bad guy, destroying evil, I'll get more into that. But to the extent that we are governed by habits of separation, then the things that we do out in the world, even if we're out there crusading, to bring down the system or something like that, they're actually strengthening the substructure of the system. But the other thing I want to say about that is that, I think that the millennial Christians, the Armageddon kind of thinkers, they're feeling the same pull as many of us are, which is the end of the world as we know it. On the left, you have people into peak oil, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but getting addicted to peak oil websites, you keep going to find has anyone ever been here? What's the latest bad news, or financial crash, or climate change, it's almost good, some new piece. It's there's this gratifying feeling that accompanies fear and dread. And I think it's quite natural to be afraid of the thing that you want the most, which is the transcendence of your boundaries. The fear and the desire, they're deeply interlinked, as I'm sure people discover here. Okay, let me make it real simple, direct and short, if I can. Well, first let me say, it's such a big picture that it's hard for me to really make it crisp without it sounding like a cliche. Suppose you have a revelation. Suppose you have a near-death experience. And you're like, oh my God, only love is real in this world. How do you communicate that? You can walk up to somebody and say, only love is real. And they're like, well, you've been reading too many New Age self-help books. So that's the dilemma that I have. And that's why I skip around a lot and tell stories and things. That said, let me try. I guess I feel sometimes a bit insecure because what I'm saying is so unorthodox that I invite judgment about, Charles is just some half-baked, airy-fairy thinker who doesn't get science or doesn't understand, the basics. So sometimes I feel like I need to really elaborate. Every culture has a mythology that answers the basic questions of life. Who are you? What's the role of human beings on Earth? What's important? How does change happen in the world? Every culture has answers for this. A story, a mythology. Our culture, our civilization, answers it like this. They say, who you are is a separate individual. There's you, and there's Mary. There's lots and lots of separate individuals here. And the nature of a self is that you're this kind of mind inside of a body, right? Or you're a soul encased in flesh. Or you're kind of this genetically programmed machine among other genetically programmed machines. Or you're this consciousness. Or you're this economic actor. Everybody agrees. Science, religion, at least in the mainstream, about what a self is. And how to... So that's one answer. Here's what a self is. Here's who you are. Another question is, what's the nature of the world outside of you? Well, it's a bunch of other selves. And aside from that, there's this kind of material reality and forces of nature that don't care about you. Like, it's raining today, that has nothing to do with you, right? It's just raining. A tidal wave could hit, a volcano could erupt. That has nothing to do with you because they're external. So how do you stay safe? Where does your well-being come from? Okay, so what I'm doing now is I'm just elaborating this mythology that we live in. What I'm going to say is that our mythology is falling apart. Our explanation for who we are, how the world works, where we came from, where we're going, what's important, what's valuable, what self is. Like the most basic structure of the way that we see the world is changing in our time. It's in this process of change. And it's changing ourselves, too. It's changing who we are. It's changing how we relate. And that New Culture Camp is part of this change. And that we are transitioning into a new story. From an old story to a new story. And the new story gives different answers to these questions. Starting with, who are you? Different answers. No longer saying, you are a separate individual in a world of other. Instead saying, you are the totality of all of your relationships. Instead saying, you are the same being looking from a different set of eyes at the same being. And maybe you experience that. Instead saying, you are a reflection of the entire universe. Therefore, everything that happens to the world is happening to you. And you can feel that. Everything that's happening to one of your community is happening to you. And if you just ignore that, this person is repulsive, this person is bad, let's just get rid of them and have a better community that way. Well, guess what? You've gotten rid of part of yourself. You've suppressed and hurt part of yourself. So I guess what I'm trying to do is to, at this moment at least, is to kind of context New Culture Camp in terms of this new story of interbeing. Gaia, as a scientific theory, basically says that the Earth is like a living being. Not necessarily actually a living being. Most scientists would shy away from saying that. They would say, well, yeah, the planet maintains homeostatic balance. It has dynamic processes. It, in many ways, acts like a living being, but it's certainly not alive for real. And even if it is alive, maybe depending on your definition of life, it's certainly not conscious. Because then I'm not being scientific. So I'm going to step right into it again. What is it to be scientific? Part of the old story says that this is super important. The characteristics of a self exist in human beings alone, and maybe a little bit in animals. But would science say that a rock is conscious? Do I have a rock here? I could use a rock right now. Does this have the qualities of a self? Babies often treat objects that we know don't have the qualities of a self as if they do, like their teddy bear. My teddy bear is tired. My teddy bear wants to go to bed. My teddy bear is thirsty. And we grow up and we realize that they are making an anthropomorphic projection, ascribing the qualities of self to something that, you know, it doesn't have a central nervous system, so how could it have thoughts? Descartes, one of the early articulators of the scientific worldview, said, I think, therefore I am. Right. I think, therefore I am. So amness is, I have amness because I am a thinker. Following that line of thinking, and perhaps taking a few liberties with it, we could say that the more of a thinker you are, the more amness that you have. And certainly in our culture, we do valorize those who are in the thinking fields. They have, even like financially, like those who operate in the world of symbols, in the financial industry, for example, or well, this is a hard case to make, and I can't probably fully make it, but there's this kind of elitism around thinking, and it goes, it fits into this, and I'll get back to the question too, but I'm going to put this down for a second, because it is heavy. It's tied in with another part of what I'm going to call the old story, which is the conquest of nature, rising above nature, where the developed person is considered to be the one who is working, well, for one thing, at the very beginning, it was the one whose feet are not touching the dirt, who's not involved in materiality. That would be the priests and the king. And so at the beginning of social hierarchies, they were the ones who had the highest status because they were separate from the ground. Even today, though, we have ideas of like raising your vibrations, which kind of implies like being less material, less involved in the flesh, you know, less involved in the market, in a higher realm, where spiritual progress happens in separation from materiality. And here at New Culture Camp, that's probably not a very popular opinion, and I think that this is part of the healing of that kind of separation. But another way, another aspect of this anti-material prejudice is to validate the things that are you know, of the mind rather than of the hands. You know, like, so the engineer has higher status than the plumber. The physicist has higher status than the engineer. The more in abstraction you are, the more you know, the same kind of thread reaches lots of places. Comment on that.
A poster that I had on my wall since my 20s said that a society that tolerates shoddy philosophy because philosophy is a noble profession, but disparages good plumbing because plumbing is a lowly profession, cannot stand. Neither its pipes nor its theories will hold water.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Okay, but let me just try to put this back together again. God, this is becoming really heady. And I do want to bring you into some processes too, but let me just finish it. I want to get back to the rock. Okay, right, anthropomorphic projection. Then we grow out of that. Realize that, right, it doesn't, okay, think, that's how I got there. Right, it obviously can't think, it doesn't have neurons, you know, it doesn't have a central nervous system. Therefore, it must be deficient in this quality of amness if we, to the extent that we accept Descartes' formulation. And it's kind of, all right, so we say it's an anthropomorphic projection, and we grow out of that. We grow up, we become more mature, we become more evolved away from that. And then we do the same thing culturally, because it's not just children who invest the qualities of self into the world of not human. It's also primitive people, indigenous people, who would look at this rock and affirm, or this stone, I'm not sure actually what it prefers to be called, but there I go. Is that a scientific statement to say it prefers something? Can you measure that preference through any tools that we have? Now, one could say that maybe someday we will expand science in order to be able to quantify a preference, to quantify a desire, and then to test whether or not this science, you could say, is the study of the measurable. Going back to Galileo, actually. But does it make scientific sense to say this rock or this stone has a preference as to what I call it, or has desires or has consciousness? Maybe in the end, what we call science will be able to affirm or deny those things. But right now, I want to touch back on Story and Cleve Baxter. And there's lots, okay, the stuff that gets marginalized. Marginalized people, marginalized cultures, marginalized parts of ourselves, marginalized sexual orientations, marginalized inanimate objects, marginalized scientific theories. These, I think, are what is going to come into that empty space that is opened when things fall apart. So Cleve Baxter would be an example, and the whole idea of plant intelligence, which was something that if you talked about it, it would ruin your career at one point. Now it's starting to come in as they say, oh, well, maybe, mycelial networks are as complicated as neural tissue and so on and so forth, and maybe, we could explain plant intelligence. And that explains some of what Cleve Baxter discovered, but maybe not all, or maybe not most. He hooked up lie detectors, basically, to plants to see what would happen if he burned their leaf. And he discovered that even the intention of burning the leaf would cause the plant to have a reaction. Or the burning of another plant's leaf would cause the plant to have a sympathetic reaction. And is that a fact? Well, some people tried to replicate his experiment and it didn't work. So maybe it was a hoax. Maybe our view of the conventional view of what plants are is right after all. Well, these people who tried to reproduce the experiment, did they actually reproduce the experiment? No, they didn't because of this. Well, these people who are criticizing the reproduction of the experiment, are they being objective? Or do they have an agenda too? You get lost in these stories. So if you take I thought he liked that, actually.
He likes it rough.
So I am not going to, again, as I said at the beginning, I am not going to persuade you of anything. I'm not even trying to. What I want is for us to play in a different house, which is that the world is composed of stories. So you have one story in which it's just a rock. It's just a bunch of, aluminum silicate and whatever other minerals are in there. It's just a bunch of minerals, and one molecule of aluminum silicate is the same as another molecule of aluminum silicate. And the whole world is composed of a whole bunch of generic protons, neutrons, and electrons, and several hundred other fundamental particles, and impersonal forces operating on them, and that's just the way it is. And the life and variety that we experience is just different permutations of those things, and that's a story, okay? And then another story says that the world is built on story, or it says that everything has a quality of sentience and other qualities of self, that the world outside of ourselves has a purpose and has desire, has an unfolding pattern to which we might contribute. And so the consequences of each story, a story offers a role that we play. The first story offers the role of the lords and masters of nature. There are these hostile or indifferent forces out there, and the way to well-being is to insulate yourself from these hostile forces, to control what lies outside of you, to dominate these competitors who, like you, are motivated or programmed by their genes to maximize reproductive self-interest, or who have a basic nature of maximizing economic self-interest. And so it's fundamentally each person for themselves. We're fundamentally selfish. And in order to be good people, we have to overcome that fundamental evil, that fundamental selfishness, to conquer the desire with reason, to conquer the flesh with the spirit, to win a war against ourselves. And that's how you become a good person. But some people don't try very hard, so we have to stop them. Those are the bad people. We have to control them. We have to punish them. We have to deter them. We have to leverage their self-interest against them with the threat of punishment in order to control the people outside of ourselves. So from this story comes everything that we see around us in our culture. A culture of control, a culture of domination, a war against the self, a war against evil. And it's all coming from a story. Another story says that the evil and violence are an expression of unmet needs. That might be what NBC would say about it. That because we are not separate beings in a universe of other, that our fundamental motivation is not to maximize the security, survival, and comfort of a separate self, but our fundamental motivation is to contribute to the well-being of our larger true self, which means that our purpose here is the opposite of what economics teaches. Our purpose is to give, to create, to contribute to that which wants to be born. Well, how could something want to be born? Is there a wanting in the world? Does a rock have a want? Yes, because the qualities of self are not just in this separate little thing here. The qualities of every quality that I have is mirrored in the reality outside of myself. So yes, the planet wants something. Yes, the land here wants something. And if I contribute to that thing, if I bow into service to that which wants to be born, I become part of a creative process that's far beyond the things that I can make happen. So here control comes up again. How do you make it happen? One of us shared earlier, sometime this week, I hope I'm generalizing it enough to make it okay with the process, the confidentiality and stuff, but one woman that once upon a time I heard said that in her work, it's always about, making sure people do stuff, and being in control, managing things. And here she's able to let go and trust things to happen, to kind of let a larger being, and she didn't say this, but as if there is something to trust, as if there is a happening outside of myself that I can join in. So a different conception of technology becomes possible. Rather than imposing control through force, you listen to what wants to happen and contribute to that thing. So it's not an abandonment of technology, as some critics of civilization advocate. But it's like this Iranian guy I met whose grandfather was a Sufi architect. And he said, when we built a mosque, the first thing we do is we would go to the site and just sit there for days or weeks or even months until we saw the mosque that wanted to be built. And then we would be in service to that. So that being in service to a larger thing that wants to happen, when you really step into that, it will arrange things that are beyond your causal control, beyond the causal control of the separate self. Synchronicities, for example, they're called. Being in just the right place at the right time. And I find that pretty much anything worth accomplishing in this world requires that. And it is humbling to me. Wow. I didn't know how to make that happen. My friend Polly Higgins is an earth lawyer. She, her cause for the last few years has been to get ecocide added as the 5th crime against peace in the Rome Statute of the United Nations. And this was, a few years ago, this was, really brewing in her, and she was on vacation with her husband in Western Scotland, in a remote area. And she said to him, I've got to talk to the UN. That's the only way to do this. I've got to go to the UN. And he said, well, okay, how are you going to do that? She said, I don't know, but it has to happen. Do you know anybody in the UN? No, but okay. And he says, and also we have a dinner appointment, a dinner date soon. Can you check what time it is? Okay, she turns on her cell phone to check what time it is. It had been off. And within 10 seconds of turning it on, it rings. She picks it up. It's the UN calling. Asking, can you give a talk at the women's meeting? There's some women's thing sponsored by the UN. Can you give a talk there? And she said, I would love to talk to the UN, but it can't be about this. I've moved on. What I want to talk about is ecocide and rights of nature. And the woman said, okay, well, I'll see if I can arrange that. And it was arranged, and then she lost her signal. And didn't get a signal again the entire time she was there in this remote area of Western Scotland. Now, I'm not offering that as proof that there's some extra material intelligence out there arranging events. Like, it's very easy to fit my little story into what I would call the old story, the old reality. I could have made that up. Or if nothing else, hey, how many times is Polly Higgins going to tell me about the day that she had some great idea and no one called? So there's a selection bias that biases us toward the incredible and the remarkable and the seemingly marvelous coincidence, when really it's just an imposition of meaning onto a senseless, unintelligent reality. Right? Nothing, the evidence I've given you could easily fit into a story, that story, or a story that there is an intelligence inherent in all things. Which story do you choose? You cannot choose, ultimately, and do not choose based on evidence and logic. We would like to think that we do. At least those of us who are open-minded and rational. Now, not to try to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, but there's quite a lot of academic research into this very question. How do people form their beliefs? And so in one study, 2005, University of Michigan, they confronted people with evidence that directly contradicted a strongly held belief, and to see what happened. And what happened was people came out of that believing even more strongly in what they had believed before, despite the contradictory evidence. Believing even more strongly. But that's probably the uneducated people, right? Yeah. Those who haven't had training in critical thinking, right? No, actually, the more educated somebody was, the less likely they were to change their beliefs when confronted with evidence.
Makes sense.
But this is something you already know. Like, I could suppose my presentation was going to be about climate change is a hoax. And I present all of this evidence, and I'm so well prepared that any rebuttal that you offer, I can counter-rebut, and I can say, well, have you looked at the origin of that study, and I can come up with overwhelming, if I've prepared well enough, unless you're an expert, I could probably overcome every objection. Is that going to change your mind? No. You're going to go home, you're going to look up the people who can rebut me, you're going to, right? What does change your mind? What does change a belief? What changes a story? This is key. If you want to change the world, and if the world is built on stories, then how do you change the story? If not through force, overwhelming somebody with superior evidence and logic. Part of the old story is change happens through force. We're back to Galileo. A force is exerted on a mass. Well, what's another way? And I'm not saying that force doesn't change a mass. But what other ways are there besides force? And this is something that is woven through the experience here. Can you tell me your name again?
Mariah.
Mariah, yes. Thank you for your patience.
You're welcome. Can I offer a mirror?
Yeah,
Reflection.
sure.
So from what I'm gathering, it seems like you are portraying science, logic, rationality, the mechanistic materialist view as the old culture, the old school. We're moving away from it. And I wonder what would happen if we switched. We turned on its head and said, what if sentience, consciousness, energy, spirit is the new reality? And it seems like you're saying science wouldn't be able to prove that. It doesn't have the tools to prove the unconscious.
It does. It's been found, scientific research recently found that there's that part of the brain responsible for consciousness.
But it seems like what you're saying is that science is limited. And so if we switch to this new understanding that consciousness is everything, that's the new story, that's the new culture, that's the new way of interacting. So if we see the leaves and the rocks and the birds, and everything is conscious, that's the new culture. Is that correct?
That might be a useful frame to see it through. I'm not talking about discarding science, rationality, scientific method. It's more about returning those things to their appropriate domain. Yeah. Yeah.
One of the different ways that change can occur is that that one can believe or experience that one has received communication about something with some new information.
Yeah. Right. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious to understand what you're saying. So you are saying that there is a story, a science story, and there is a story, as I think Mariah said, that embodies everything with a level of consciousness. Are you saying that is that part of the story that the alternative story or the other story?
Yeah, I would say so.
All right.
Yeah.
And there's part of me that thinks you're saying that's a better story, and I think, but there's another part of me that thinks you're just saying that that's an alternative story that may have usefulness to us, along with the original story, the science story.
Yeah, I would say that certainly each story resonates with certain parts of myself. And the story that, I'm not saying that science is a story, I'm saying science is part of the story. The story has many different expressions. It has a political expression, for example. It has an economic expression. It has an expression in medicine, in education, in love and intimacy, human relationships.
It was just, for me, it was just a convenient way of categorizing that story. And
right.
I get that there's a much broader context. And
yeah.
this other
Right. And so what I'm saying is that this story isn't working very well anymore.
In some domains.
Yes.
Or in all of them.
Well, I mean, in certain domains it works as well as it ever has. But as far as like the crisis of the planet, so here we are facing climate change. So to extend the technologies of control would be okay. The problem is excessive CO2 levels. The solution is to reduce the CO2 levels. How do we do that? Well, we can seed the atmosphere with sulfuric acid. We can seed the ocean with iron oxide. We can build big mirrors and reflect it, and that'll bring those levels down. It's a numerical problem with a numerical solution. The new story might say, hey, CO2 itself is a symptom of overconsumption and of a certain way that we see nature. Well, where does overconsumption come from? the old story says, well, it's because we have this greedy, selfish impulse to maximize our own self-interest. And so in order to reduce consumption, we're going to have to conquer that. We're going to have to limit it. We're going to have to maybe shame people through the threat of social ostracism and so on and so forth. The new story might say, overconsumption is feeding a hunger for things that actually material goods can't meet. And what is that hunger? And so, for example, you take a shopping addict and you bring him here, and maybe like that whole dialogue about can I have it, can't I have it, I'm not going to have it, I'm not going to have it, oh, okay, I'm going to have it. Like the whole addictive dialogue is gone because the real need wasn't for a fourth flat screen TV. The real need was for connection.
I'd like to propose, and I don't need this to be decided on, but propose an idea that there's some core element of science that is, let's call it a story module, that is a part of the old story, but might also fit into a number of new stories.
Yes. I mean, fundamentally, science is an attitude of humility that says, I will ask the universe what's true. That's really what an experiment is supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so I read a lot of science. I don't want to trigger like science bad. You know what I mean? Fundamentally, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
I feel seen by that comment. Thank you.
Yeah. What I was going to say is that what I meant was that truth and facts are not too coextensive. They're not identical.
Can you define coextensive for me, please?
Extending over the same territory.
Thank you.
Yeah. But what I was going to offer is an example of a true story and an example of a story that's not true. How the Grinch Stole Christmas is a true story. You can feel it when you read it. In contrast to most children's literature today, the Berenstain Bears, not a true story. Made up. I'm not taking a deconstructionist position either, a postmodern position that truth is yet another construct that originates in these separate selves. All right, so here's what I'd like to invite, and yeah, boy, this place triggers me.
You guys' money's worth. We got our money's worth.
So,
welcome, Charles.
Thank you. So,
a lot of stories are good about the same conversation.
So, what I'd like to offer, though, I'd like people to gather in groups of 3 or 4 or 5, let's say 4, and to share a personal story, an event that unraveled the story of normal for you. An event that gave you the feeling that reality is bigger than I thought it was. Now, this could be material reality, it could be social reality, it could be relationship reality. It could be, for example, an experience of being forgiven. It could be an experience of generosity. It could be an experience of extraordinary healing. But it's the experience that's like, wow, I was living in a much smaller world than really exists. Because these are the kind of things that change our beliefs. These experiences. After you have that experience, a whole different set of beliefs that you never could have been persuaded of before. It's like, oh yeah, of course, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so not only experiencing it yourself, but even telling the story of it weakens somebody else's story, or invites them into a similar story, or strengthens that part of themselves that's also had an experience of reality falling apart, but they don't dare believe it. They don't dare accept that invitation because the power of the story of normal is so strong around them that it just pulls you back. And am I crazy? You know? Am I the only one? Is it my delusion? Is it my fantasy? Or was that just some kind of peak experience that happens outside of reality? And then I go back, you know, to the real world, right? So sharing these stories and making them visible forms kind of a field of the new story. And we all walk together into it. So take a minute.